Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us in this webinar titled The Entry into Force of the Basel Ban Amendment, History and Implications. Today we will have a presentation by Jim Puckett from the Basel Action Network. The presentation will last for 40 minutes, and afterwards we will have a question and answer session for about 20 minutes. During the question and answering session, you will be able to type in questions that I will read for Jim to answer. Now for introducing Jim. Jim Puckett has been a global environmental justice activist for over 30 years, first with Greenpeace and later with Basel Action Network, an organization he founded in 1990. He has been active with the Basel Convention since 1989 and was instrumental in ensuring the passage, implementation, and eventual entry into force of the Basel Ban Amendment. The Ban Amendment, which prohibits the export of hazardous waste from developed to developing countries, has been hailed as a landmark for environmental justice. Since December 5th, it is now legally binding for the 98 countries that have ratified it and must be respected by all of the 187 parties of the Basel Convention. Today, Jim will discuss the history and important implications of this groundbreaking agreement. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Tiffany, and happy Friday, everybody. I'm coming to you here from the Seattle office of the Basel Action Network, where it's still Thursday. I think most people are probably enjoying Friday at the moment. And we have an interesting story for you today. I'm going to tell you a story about environmental justice, about global governance, and what's happened in the last 25 years on a very, sometimes seemingly esoteric issue. This is me, yours truly. If you need to get in touch with me, that's my email and the band website. You can certainly contact us there. Today, the agenda is to look first at the Basel Convention. And what we're going to learn is that the Basel Convention always was intended by the authors of it to have a ban in it. It was always the original promise of the Basel Convention to have the Basel ban. But we're going to learn it took 25 years to get there, and it happened last month. So we're going to look first at the Basel Convention without the ban, which we've been living with. And then we're going to talk more briefly about why waste moves. Why is this an issue? It's very important to know the drivers behind it. And then we'll get into the Basel Ban Amendment, starting with the history. And the history of the Ban Amendment truly is the history of the Basel Convention and vice versa. And then we'll end by talking about the impacts of the ban that we can foresee, impacts of it going into force, and then we'll take questions. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the Basel Convention. The real name of it is the Convention on the Control of the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal. It was adopted in 1989. I've spent most of my working life working on the convention and more particularly on the Ban Amendment. So I was there in 1989. I was with Greenpeace at the time. It entered into force in 1992. A convention is the same thing as a treaty. It's a body of international law. It's an instrument of international law. And currently it has a great number of parties, 186 parties. Those are the member countries. So it's really quite a good global saturation of members. And they meet in Geneva most often in big rooms with the country names on every desk, and up in the cheap seats is where the NGOs are with their names. Again, we've been following as BAN this convention since 1997, and before that I personally was following it with Greenpeace. This document on the right is the convention, and this is what has happened is this convention now is fundamentally going to be a different text as of December 5th. It now has a new article in it, and we'll be talking about that because it now contains the Basel Ban. It now possesses what it originally promised the world. So let's first talk about what the Basel Convention without the ban, what it does, what it is all about. There's soft law and there's hard law. Soft law are general obligations where nobody is going to get arrested. It's not going to be a criminal offense if you don't do those things. They're more general, but they're very important because they give the direction of the convention. And so the convention calls for national self-sufficiency in waste management. In other words, deal with your own waste, country by country. And it calls for minimizing all forms of transboundary movements of hazardous and other wastes. We'll talk about what that means, but minimizing those movements to the degree possible. It calls for minimizing the generation, the creation of hazardous and other wastes, very important. And it calls for ensuring the environmentally sound management of those wastes which are produced, that you cannot eliminate their generation at that point in time. So the hard law of it, though, has to do with trade. And it really is much more definitive, and it could involve illegal traffic, which is a criminal act under the convention. So the hard law defines hazardous waste and other waste, and it does that in the scope on Article 1. And hazardous waste is defined in two ways. It's defined by some annexes that list hazardous substances and hazardous characteristics, but it's also defined by national law. So any country can say this is hazardous for us, and all the other countries have to respect that. So those are the two ways hazardous waste is defined. And there's another category of waste called other waste. And this is Annex II, and these are wastes for special consideration. They're very important as well, particularly very recently we've added some plastic waste to that list. So those include waste collected from households, incinerator ashes from incinerating household waste, and certain plastic waste that have been newly adopted into this list. So what does it do in terms of hard law with respect to trade? It controls the exports of these wastes. So there's two ways it controls them. One is the default method, which is called prior informed consent. It's a paperwork regime where you notify countries, you get their consent before you can export. And this procedure is defined in Article 6. It also defines what illegal traffic is. So anything that's not done in accordance with Article 6 is illegal traffic and considered a criminal act. So in the national context, people can be sent to jail by Basel party governments if they don't abide by these rules, which should be implemented into national law. And then there's another form of control, which are prohibitions. And countries may ban imports on a national basis, and everybody needs to respect that. So that is part of the convention. And there's a ban in there on exports to Antarctica. So that was the only geographic ban that came into the original convention, even though people wanted much more than that. And then there's finally a ban on the trade between parties of the treaty, of the convention, and non-parties. And there's an exception to that, and that's if you have a special agreement called an Article 11 agreement. This is an important ban, however, because the United States is a non-party. So that means unless you have such an agreement, nobody can trade with the United States that is a party. That's most of the world. And then finally, now, today, or as of December 5th, there's a new ban, the ban that was always intended to be in the convention, which has been known as the Basel Ban Amendment, which is now not going to be an amendment anymore. It's going to be part and parcel of the convention. So these are the view of the world. We have 186 parties. And again, I said there's huge saturation, and it's true. There's 193 United Nations members. So only 6 countries are not parties that are part of the UN. And it's stunning. It's just startling and shocking to look at the list. And so you see East Timor, Grenada, Haiti, San Marino, South Sudan, Tuvalu. either very, very small countries or very, very destitute, poor countries. And then you have the United States. And it's just shocking that the United States is not a party. It happens to be the most wasteful country per capita on the face of the earth. So we make more waste in the United States here, anywhere else per capita, and yet we're not part of the world's only waste treaty. So let's get into why waste moves. And it really is all about what we call cost externalization. And it's really why all pollution happens, really, whether it be air pollution, water pollution, and now waste trade, the pollution of the developing world. It all comes about from cost externalization. And what that is it's truly a market distortion. It's an economic phenomenon. We call it a distortion, and yet it's so common that it really is the norm. It's what happens when an action is taken by an actor that damages others or damages nature, resulting in a cost that is not paid for by that actor, either to prevent the damage in the first place or to compensate or mitigate for it later. So it's really a lack of accounting, a lack of accountability for something you have done. You didn't have to pay for the damage you caused. And throughout history, those that extract resources, that use resources, that harness technology have seldom had to pay or charge the true cost in its entirety. That includes the cost for damage done to others. And sadly, it's the norm. And this is why we have pollution and have so much, human rights abuses, et cetera. So much of the world's ills are caused by the fact that people are not paying for the damage they cause. So if we were to correct economics, we would do very well for the world. But traditionally, economics has seen that as just something that everyone can accept. So with cost externalization, the true cost to society is greater than the market price. And looking at waste management through this lens, it's very interesting. The history of waste management, pardon my funny drawings here, but we had a factory and they used to put out waste in the backyard and burn it. People didn't like that. It was really a nuisance. So they made smokestacks and put it up into the atmosphere and put it downwind. People didn't like that either. So factories started putting it into outfalls and throwing their waste into water systems. And people didn't like that because it polluted their water downstream. So there was a point in history where we were taking barrels out to sea and dumping them in the ocean. And we got away with that for some time until that was also outlawed. So throughout this, we were finding ways to have others or the earth pay for the damage of the pollution. And then we had laws that attempted to internalize those costs. So with the cost internalization in developed countries, where it started happening first via regulation, had a huge impact. And we banned with nuisance laws the open burning. We banned with Clean Air Acts and other types of clean air laws the pollution of the air through smokestacks. Clean Water Act in the United States, for example, banned the dumping in the waterways, and the London Convention banned the ocean dumping. And so where was the last refuge for the polluters? Boom, we had a spate of waste trade going from developed to developing countries. This internalization of costs created a much higher disposal costs, management costs in the north, in the developed countries. And so the path of least resistance, the path to greatest externalization was to exploit developing countries, which lacked the regulation to internalize the costs themselves. So that was the phenomenon we experienced very shockingly in the late 80s. And we're seeing it now with e-waste trade to Africa and Asia still going on. We see the shipbreaking of old ships, where they're being traded to South Asian beaches, still going on. And most recently, we're seeing plastic waste trade moving to Southeast Asia, for example, where most of it is burned and dumped. So this is still a phenomenon. Even though it's taken 25 years to get the ban in force, it's still highly relevant today. So the moral of the story is that pollution and labor abuse follows a path of greatest opportunity for cost externalization. And a case in point that really brings it home, this gentleman here on the right is Lawrence Summers. When he was chief economist of the World Bank, he wrote an infamous memo in 1991 where he expounded on how traditional economics looks at these issues. And he was very provocative. He said he was trying to be provocative, but nobody knows for sure whether he was serious or trying to be ironic. But it doesn't matter, because what he was dictating here and what he was saying is how economists at the time and even today are still looking at these issues. He said, I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. He also said in the same memo, I've always thought that underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. And in response, this memo was leaked and went around the world. And in response, Jose Lessenberger, who was then the Brazilian Secretary of Environment, responded, your reasoning is perfectly logical, but totally insane. Your thoughts provide a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionist thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in. So the impeccable logic that he was describing really plays out today. It played out 20 years ago. It really is, again, the disposal costs of cost internalization in rich countries created a gradient, a toboggan ride for waste to go from north to south, from rich to poor. And that was the impeccable logic, which still plays out today. So this brings us to the Ban Amendment and why it was the centerpiece, or meant to be the centerpiece, of the Basel Convention, how it came about. It was adopted at COP3 of the Basel Convention in 1995. It entered into force, again, just last month, and it currently has 98 parties to that amendment. We'll talk more detail about it. So again, that amendment is now part and parcel of the convention. We don't need to call it an amendment anymore. We'll just call it the Basel Ban, and it's a new article 4A. So the history of the ban, again, is the history of the convention. We had a spate of these waste trade events in the late 1980s, one after the other, causing scandals around the world. We had the Callin Sea, which is a ship that left Philadelphia on September 5th of 1986, carrying incinerator ash from that city, where it wanted to go and dump it somewhere, and it went to Haiti first and dumped half of its load on the beaches of Haiti. And then the ship was chased out of Haiti and went around the world trying to find places to dump the rest of its load. We had the situation in Cocoa Beach, Nigeria, where Italian chemical waste from the Italian chemical industry were loaded on ships and brought to this part of Nigeria and just left on a farmer's land. That created a massive scandal where the Italians were forced to take it back. We had the Islip garbage barge, which was New York City waste. And it also went on a voyage looking for a place to dump that waste in the Caribbean. And it created this huge garbage odyssey of the barge going from one country to another, looking for a home for this waste. These scandals created quite a sensation, and Greenpeace began to chronicle and target these incidents in a very lively campaign. They created this inventory, which was like a phone book in size, of all the different schemes they were documenting at those late 1980s, and publishing this and really exposing every one of these schemes to move waste from north to south, from rich to poor. So the United Nations was prompted to get involved and create a treaty. And Mustafa Tolba was head of UNEP at the time. He called for this new convention to protect Africa and the world. And he said, this is the perfect reason we have United Nations, we have international treaties, this is a transboundary issue. He felt very concerned because he himself was African. But the countries that came to the negotiations most of the world wanted to ban it. They wanted a full stop prohibition. And of course, that is not what happened. The convention was adopted in 1989 without a ban. The reason the ban was not there in the adoption of any international law, it's done by consensus. And so it's a lowest common denominator effect. And any one country can bring it down to that level. And in this case, it was the United States. I was there when the US State Department got up and said, we cannot accept any type of ban that would be very prejudicial to our country. So it was adopted without a ban. And to the credit of the developing countries there, they did not rest with that. A banner was hung on the side of the building at the time of adoption saying Basel Convention legalizes toxic terror. And it was denounced. And the African group, which was the most active group in the world, vocally denouncing the waste trade, decided to walk out without signing the convention, and they vowed to create their own regional convention in Africa. And in fact, that's what happened, is that regional agreements were formed in various parts of the developing world. We had the Central American Agreement with 5 Central American countries. All their presidents got together and signed a prohibition from importing waste to Central Africa. Bamako Convention in Africa, Central America, sorry. Bamako Convention in Africa was created in 1991 and went into force in 1998. Waigani Treaty in the South Pacific, they made their own version of Bamako. And in the Mediterranean region, the Izmir Protocol was created. So all of these are still in existence, but they were building blocks to lead to the adoption of the Ban Amendment at the global level. So the Basel meeting adopts its first ban in 1994 as a decision. And very soon thereafter, and this is what that agreement looked like, it was first proposed by the group of 77, which is the developing country grouping at that time, and China joined in. And it was during that meeting in 1994 that Europe, the EU, decided to join hands and depart from the rest of the industrialized countries and join the developing countries in supporting the ban. So that was a major development, and that's why the decision passed there in 1994 with the help of the EU. The non-EU industrialized countries, known as the JustCans, did not support, but this decision was adopted nevertheless. And immediately people started, the JustCans said, this is not a legally binding agreement, it's just a decision, it's not legally binding. So Denmark proposed that in the next meeting, they come back with a decision to amend the convention, and actually did that. So that happened next. And then the ensuing years were just, for all those 25 years that we've experienced, between 1995 and last month, was just one attempt after the other by the JustCans countries to undo, weaken, or delay entry into force of the ban. It's almost a miracle that it never happened. We were able to fight off every attempt, but these were some of the efforts that were made. So again, immediately they said it's not legally binding. You have to come back with an amendment, which is what we did. Then they said, oh, well, you can use Article 11 agreements to circumvent the ban. We just have to sign a side agreement, and then any country can circumvent the ban. Fortunately, parties strongly disagreed, including the EU, and they lodged legal opinions as to why that was impossible. Next was an attempt to add new countries to water down the Annex VII of the ban, the group of countries it applies to basically make it an opt-in, opt-out ban. And that was attempted in 1996 and 97. And it was decided at COP4, the 4th meeting, that no changes to Annex VII could happen until entry into force of the ban amendment. And as a trade-off for that agreement, a study which lasted years and years about Annex VII was embarked upon, which wasted people's time tremendously, but it was the trade-off. So next we had a massive lobbying effort, which went on for years, trying to prevent countries from joining the ban. So many countries were lobbied heavily by the United States, Canada, Japan, for example, not to join the ban. This is why it was so slow to enter into force. And then finally, the last gasp really was when people said, well, the treaty is not really clear about how many countries it takes for an amendment to go into force. We think it means that 3/4 of the parties that exist now, rather than the ones that were there at adoption, are required for it to enter into force. So this created a huge debate, a huge impasse. And finally, Switzerland and Indonesia joined in a country-led initiative, a diplomatic effort to break that logjam. And they did so in 2011 at COP10 with a decision to have the early entry into force. So those things we've been fighting for years, just to show you that this was not easy. They came back again and again trying to undo this attempt to internalize costs globally. So finally, December 5th, boom, it enters into force. There was not much fanfare about that. Certainly, it was a quiet day in Geneva, but they did put this on the website that there was a gathering of the diplomatic community in Geneva to mark the entry into force of this landmark agreement. So what does the ban do? Let's go through that really quickly. I think you know the main guts of it, but it fulfills the original promise of the convention and changes its text forever. So we now have a new convention, very different. It adds a new preambular paragraph explaining why it's happening. It says, recognizing that transboundary movements of hazardous waste, especially to developing countries, have a high risk of not constituting an environmentally sound management of hazardous waste as required by this convention. So they don't talk about cost externalization, but that's really what they're talking about. That's why there's a high risk. And it creates a new annex, an Annex VII of the developed countries, which is defined as members of the European Union, members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and Liechtenstein. So that's the countries on Annex VII. We hope it stays that way. And it adds a new article, Article 4A, which prohibits the export of hazardous waste as defined by the annexes of the convention from Annex VII countries to non-Annex VII countries for any reason. That's paraphrasing it, but that's what it does. So technically, it also does another thing which people have not recognized very widely, is that technically, while it only directly applies to those parties that have ratified it, that's the way international law works. You can never be forced to accept anything. Another part of the convention already requires that all Basel parties must respect the prohibitions of other parties. So that means that Annex VII parties, the developed countries that have not ratified it, must respect the Basel Ban ratifications of the non-Annex VII countries that have. So for example, Canada has not ratified, but they're a party. They have not ratified the ban amendment, but they still cannot export to Indonesia, a country that has ratified it. So the effect of the Basel Ban is one of internalizing costs. It puts a wall up, says, no, you cannot do this. You cannot externalize your costs that easily to developing countries. You have to take responsibility for it at home. What the ban does not do, it does not prohibit trade from non-Annex VII countries to any other countries. So the prohibition is only from Annex VII countries. It does not prohibit trade between Annex VII countries. So Canada and Japan can trade with one another. And it does not include the other waste, the Annex II, unless countries choose to do that. And the EU has set a really good example. They, in the implementation of the ban amendment, they include Annex II as part of it. So again, we're including those plastic wastes that are mixed and dirty. Those are also prohibited from the European Union. We hope other countries of Annex VII do the same. So facts, the interesting facts about the Basel Ban. Currently, there's 98 out of 187 parties that have ratified it. So we have 89 that we need to bring into the fold. That's our homework going forward. Of the 41 Annex VII countries, 35 have already implemented the ban, which is powerful, and why maybe there's not that much of an earthquake of seismic proportions of it going into force, that countries like all of the European Union had already implemented it. And very interesting, when the US finally gets around to ratifying the convention, they will have to accept the ban that they have always opposed because it will be part of what they have to ratify. And while the ban was adopted by consensus, the Just Cans group of industrialized countries continues to oppose it. We hope this changes, but that group includes Japan, US, South Korea, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So this is the group of countries that are in Annex VII now. There's 41 of them. You can see that 35 of these have already implemented. So the real challenge is Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and the US, the Just Cans group. So the impacts of the amendments entry into force are really something to talk about and to try to look into our crystal ball and figure out, what does this mean now? What's going to change? And what I think is going to happen is that Just Cans countries will increasingly look out of step with the rest of the world. The convention that they joined has changed, and they're going to look really out of date if they don't recognize that and become part of the convention, which is now published and now is out there. So pressure is now on them to accept the entire convention with the ban. Increasingly, all exports of hazardous and other waste to developing countries will be viewed as completely unacceptable, regardless of ratifications. I think it's going to be a very strong message. It's now law. All countries will be under increasing pressure then to enforce the ban. And non-Annex VII countries that have not ratified it, that have been under pressure from the Just Cans lobby, will now begin to ratify, I think, in great numbers. So the environmental gains, everyone knows, of course, the downstream impacts. We're going to protect the environment and peoples in developing countries from blatant pollution and exposure from this type of dirty trade. But most people don't recognize another very important benefit, and that is the upstream impacts. This ban will again provide incentives to internalize costs, strong new economic and legal incentives for implementing waste prevention and green design of products at source, which is much more efficient than managing waste once produced. And finally, it's got to be seen as a major victory for global environmental justice. We're basically stating that environmental considerations are more important than free trade. And we're also saying that cost externalization will not be tolerated. So in all this world we're living in right now, a lot of bad news is going on. I'm happy to report that this is very good news, but of course you have to be vigilant. Anything that is done can be undone. And already there are 2 industries that are seeking exemptions from the Basel Convention and therefore from the ban. And that is the world's shipping industry. They're trying to claim that ships are not a waste. Basel has never agreed with that position, but they have moved to create their own treaty. And the IT industry, the computer industry, is now seeking exemptions for electronics, which they say might be repaired or repairable. Therefore, we don't need to control them as waste. So those remaining efforts are ongoing, and there's something we have to really work on and be vigilant about. And again, the ship recycling issue and the computer industry is pushing really hard on a slippery slope strategy to try to pull electronic waste out of the convention just by saying, well, it can be repaired, therefore it's not really waste. So these are the ongoing challenges we have. They can't change the actual law in its obligations, but they can change the definitions of what is in the scope of that law, what is considered a waste. This is what is happening in these 2 industries. So the follow-up needed now are that parties that have ratified, they need to ensure that they have implemented the ban into their national legislation so they can prosecute it locally. They need to provide the necessary training to customs and border agents for enforcement. And again, consider doing what the EU has done and add Annex II waste to the ban. Parties that have yet to ratify, those 89, ratify at the earliest opportunity. One can no longer claim that they have ratified the convention in full if the ban is neglected. So all parties to the convention should also oppose efforts to weaken the ban and the Basel Convention by the electronics industry. And in that regard, we have a revised e-waste guideline, which is a compromise with the industry to make sure that we have full accountability for e-waste, even if it's repaired. And BAN has created such a compromise guideline. You can learn more about by going on our website. And then civil society and citizens, press your government to ratify the ban amendment if it has not yet done so, and press them to ensure that it's implemented into national legislation and enforced if they have ratified it. So if you want to learn more about all this, and you want to learn the status of your country, I don't expect you to write down this link, but it's an invaluable link, and this will be recorded and posted, this whole presentation. But that link gets you directly into the United Nations Treaty Collection. And that's a definitive place where you can see precisely who's ratified and when. And if it's not on that list, it's not real. So that's a very important link to have. And we've also produced, IPEN and BAN has produced a guidance document on this issue. It goes into more detail even than this presentation about the implications and next steps for the BAN amendment. And that is posted on the IPEN website and the BAN website. It's going to be available in Spanish, English, French, Russian, and perhaps some other languages. So you can grab that and pull that down. So I thank you very much. And thanks again for joining and listening. And now you have an opportunity to ask some questions with Tiffany's help. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Now we will open up the opportunity for people to ask questions. I would ask, instead of, if it's possible, instead of raising your hand, to type in your questions into the question and answer box, in which I will be able to just facilitate through reading them out loud. Some of you might be calling in or unable to do so, in which I'm not really sure how the call-in would work, but we will figure that out. I have a few questions already here for you, Jim.
Sure.
The first one is 3 separate questions. So the first one is from Lindsay Weisan, and she asks, to what extent is the PIC procedure effective? The second one is, how could monitoring and control of illegal traffic be improved? And lastly, do you see US becoming a member in the near future?
Wow. Okay. The PIC procedure, it can be very effective. There have been some complaints from the very beginning, though, that notification and consent is not enough. We needed to have this full prohibition because countries can have their arms twisted to consent by other countries. And people did not want to see that happening. They didn't want to see the economic powers pressed on a small developing country to accept waste and become a sacrificial area for the world's waste. So this is why the ban was so important to developing countries from the beginning, and PIC was rejected. However, PIC is the default mechanism that takes place, and it will always take place between developed countries and probably between developing countries. So it is important to make sure that it works properly. And there's been a lot of complaints that countries are not properly making their notifications and consents in a timely way, so waste gets stuck. And this is being remedied by some electronic systems that are going to make it a lot easier to efficiently streamline these procedures. They are important, especially when you're moving waste, perhaps in Europe, from France to Germany, etc. If you're moving waste from one part of Africa to another part of Africa, very important that there are controls, and the default control system is PIC. So the other question was how to improve controls. I mentioned somewhat that in the last answer with respect to electronic systems, but I think a lot of education is very helpful. So workshops that are funded for enforcement, customs agents, etc. So people know what this is all about, know why it's important. Judges need to know why to prosecute this, why it's a crime, etc. In the US, I'm not going to hold my breath for the US deciding anything in the near future. It's largely a dysfunctional Congress. They have been pathetic with respect to ratifying any treaties. So it's really not a country at the moment that looks at multilateralism favorably. A lot of that has to do with the Republican Party, but even in the Democratic regimes, the Basel Ban was never accepted, and the Basel Convention was never ratified. So part of that has to do with industries pushing back within the US. But yeah, we're not going to hold our breath for the United States to join the treaty anytime soon. But again, when they do, they have to accept the Ban Amendment.
Thanks. And then next from Peter Feldman. For enforcement, is this enforce a capable body? And what authority do they have? Lastly, how is it funded?
You're talking about Enforce, the acronym?
Yes.
Yeah, it is it's not really an enforcement body. It is a group of enforcement agencies and stakeholders. So these are groups that concern themselves with enforcement, but they're not an enforcement body. International law is enforced at the national level primarily. There's very few international treaties that have their own enforcement mechanisms. The Basel Convention has a non-compliance mechanism, but it's mainly reviews cases that are brought to it. It doesn't prosecute them. So enforcement has to take place at the national level. And it's very important that governments provide resources for that.
Okay. Next, we have from Tricia Fairley. She has two questions. The first is for plastics. Why is PIC insufficient and ban needed? And then also had mentioned she's from New Zealand, and why has New Zealand been so resistant to the ban?
New Zealand, it's a very good question. They have often followed Australia. Australia has a major mining industry that creates a lot of hazardous waste. Australia and New Zealand have always been in lockstep with the rest of the JustCans, and so they've always been opposed to the Ban Amendment. I don't think they export much. They export some lead acid batteries to the Philippines, I believe, but very little actually to get excited about, but they're ideologically opposed to the ban and its basic function, which is internalizing costs. So that's a shame. With plastics, again, the dynamic of pressuring countries to consent. Most developing countries realize there's a problem with corruption. There's a problem with ministries that will sign things, and the next thing you know, you have loads of waste which gets burned in your territory. China is a case in point, where for years China was allowing illegal trade, and finally they woke up to the fact of ecological economics, and the cost externalities far outweighed the benefits of the economic benefits, and they have very strictly now, with their national sword policy, banned the import of all types of waste, including plastic waste, but moreover, besides just banning it, they have enforced it. So now it's almost impossible to bring the massive amounts of electronic waste and plastic waste and paper scrap that used to flow to China pretty much freely. It's almost impossible to have it go through. And we know that that ban is effective because we actually have been putting GPS trackers in electronics for about 10 years now. And we follow electronic waste, and we know precisely where it goes with real-time, real-world tracking. And nothing is going to mainland China anymore. So it shows the world what can be done with enforcement. And it shows also that China has done the calculus and realized that waste trade is a net negative for their country.
Thank you. Now from Tripti Aurora, what are the immediate impacts of the Basel Ban Amendment on ship-breaking industry, and will it make it illegal?
Well, that's an excellent question. So the Basel Convention grappled with the ship recycling issue. We started raising it years ago when I was with Greenpeace, that this is a type of waste. It's certainly a hazardous waste, with ships having asbestos and oils and PCBs on board, et cetera, heavy metals. So just because they're big doesn't mean it's not a hazardous waste. But the shipping industry, once we started doing that, went ballistic. They went crazy, and they said, no, a ship can never be a waste. It's a ship, it operates on the sea. So that debate happened for years. And finally, they were losing the debate because scientifically they can't win that one. And so they did what's called venue shopping. They decided to create their own treaty by running to the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is largely controlled by the shipping industry, even though they call themselves the United Nations Convention or institution. They are basically run by the shipping industry. So there they had a very friendly venue to create an alternative agreement called the Hong Kong Convention for ship recycling. The Hong Kong Convention is not in force. It doesn't have any type of ban. It doesn't have any ability for countries to say, no, we can't, we don't want your old ships. So it's doesn't mention human rights anywhere. It's completely a minimalist convention. Fortunately, it's not in force. But we have this dynamic where the shipping industry can continue to avoid the Basel Convention by waiting to declare a ship as a waste until it's on the high seas. And so the control mechanisms of Basel are somewhat futile. However, there have been some really good case examples in the law, particularly in Europe, of ship owners being brought to court and prosecuted for violations of the Ban Amendment. So it has been used, but it's imperfect, and we have been trying to wake people up to the fact that it needs to be improved, that the Basel Convention is the only treaty that applies to old ships moving from developed to developing countries.
Thank you. Next from Marina Bukoba. Is there a chance that there will be more countries that will be added to the Annex, I think it's 7, or is this not an issue?
It's a big issue, and it's a very important question. So I mentioned back in 1997, this was a big effort by the people wanting to water down the ban. They went to Israel and Slovenia and Monaco, and they said, we want you to join, to push to be on part of Annex 7. And if it got to the point where countries could just raise their hand and say, we want to be on Annex 7 without any criteria that is solid, like OECD membership or EU membership, which has a lot of important criteria and hoops and hurdles to achieve, then we could have a situation where the whole ban could fall apart. So I think we're in a position now, though, that is unlikely. I think most countries realize that the OECD grouping and the EU grouping makes sense to do what we need to do with this ban, but it could be proposed again. It could be another attack, and again, never lose your vigilance. So they could come back and say, a bunch of countries could say, we want to be part of Annex 7, and then this whole debate gets opened up again. That could well happen.
Okay, from Peter Feldman, does the US currently transport hazardous waste to other countries?
Well, Americans do, yes. And the US not being part of the Basel Convention, we have every day on the West Coast of the US, maybe today about 50 containers will leave full of hazardous or other waste as defined by the convention, completely uncontrolled. And we've been fighting this flow of electronic waste for years. Used to be 100 containers a day. China finally said no. So it's gotten to be less and less, but it is moving to other parts of the world like Southeast Asia. And it's a very bizarre situation because it's legal to export it from the US, but as soon as it gets on the high seas, it's illegal traffic because the countries that it's heading toward are prohibited from receiving it because the US being a non-party, they're not allowed to trade in waste with parties. So we're basically aiding and abetting criminal trafficking and waste every day and not taking responsibility for it. And the traders, subject their trading partners to criminality, to prosecutions every day. And this is what we've been living with now. So the answer is yes. The US is very much involved in criminal trafficking and waste.
From Marissa, she would like to know, does the Basel Convention work in OCDE countries? In Mexico, Basel is mandatory, but if OCDE does not address plastics, how does the policy rule?
The OECD is definitely part of Basel, except for the US. And so the recent decisions by the Basel Convention to include certain types of plastic waste under the control mechanism, the OECD now, because the US objected to this, is in a big debate about whether they should adopt these new plastic definitions and control procedures within trade within the OECD. So that is an ongoing debate. All the other OECD countries are happy to include these under the control procedure of PIC, but the US does not want to do that. So they're at an impasse because decisions are usually done by consensus at the OECD, and the US is saying we don't want to be part of this. So that debate is ongoing, and they've had a few meetings. We're observers in those meetings, and we've been putting the arguments out there that this is actually good for the environment to have these controls, obviously, and cost internalization is a good thing for the environment.
Okay, from Dr. Kuipo, how is the Basel ban will affect the Bamako Convention? How will it affect it? Do you foresee major amendments to happen there?
I think Bamako, of course, is very much aligned with the ban amendment. It was the result of not having the ban amendment for Africa for all those years. But there's virtue in having both ratified. So African countries, we're going to really encourage to ratify the ban amendment and the Basel Convention as well, now that they have a ban amendment, and also to be ratifying Bamako, the Indigenous African Continental Treaty. Bamako kind of leads the way. It's stronger than Basel with its definitions and includes more waste within its scope. For example, it includes nuclear waste where Basel does not. So many things make Bamako very important as a leadership instrument and kind of the head of the spear where we need to be going. So we hope that all African countries will ratify both of those bans instruments.
Thank you. From Morten Hemkaus, you touched upon e-waste exports. What do you think about a setup in which used electronic products are exported to low-income countries for refurbishment? For example, as part of a bonded warehouse system, in order to take advantage of low labor costs and prolong their lifetime, all given that there is a due diligence process for checking their functionality and ensuring that they're not waste upon export. Defunct spare parts are shipped back to the country of origin, like the EU, and there's a full bill of materials, no leakages.
So this is a debate that, the countries of the Just Cans group have argued this as an argument against a full ban. And what they fail to recognize is that when you have cost externalization, it's not just about what happens at a particular facility. A facility theoretically could be state of the art, but what you have to look at is the whole context of a country. Does the country, because by virtue of being poor, does it have the infrastructure to support a good facility? Does it have all the downstream waste management? Does it have the laws protecting human health, the environment, worker protection rights, medical clinics for workers, etc.? All of that safety net infrastructure is part and parcel of a weaker economy. And if you were to raise that economy with that infrastructure, which is so important for protecting human health, the environment, then the waste wouldn't move anymore because there would not be this gradient of less costs. So the labor costs would go up. And this is part of what it means to be a weak or a strong economy, is that you have safety nets to protect the population and the environment. So no, when you really, it sounds great theoretically that, you can take advantage of cheap labor to do these dirty jobs and give people work, but you're poisoning people. And the reason being is the safety nets do not exist.
From Francesca Bevan, what is the ability of countries to leave the convention? I'm from the UK, and clearly with Brexit coming up, and if a trade deal with the US was decided, could the UK leave the convention easily?
Yeah, it can be done. it's very rare for countries to walk away from treaties, particularly when they're really used to them and respect them. And even though the UK is leaving the EU, they have not shown any intention not to fully cooperate with the Paik procedure and the other requirements of the Basel Convention. So I've never heard that anybody was moving that direction. Can be done, of course, but very rare.
Coming from Sarah, many people in developing countries live from e-waste, so they have jobs from working e-waste, working on every day as the only way to continue living. What could be the solution for these developing countries?
Well, it's a big myth to say it's the only way. And this is commonly a myth that's commonly trotted out, is that it must be the only thing they can do. That's why they're doing it. Well, when we really studied China, we realized that a lot of the workers were not going to starve to death. They didn't work on electronics anymore. They were simply not going to be able to have extra cash. So that's a problem as well. But is it ever justifiable to poison people just because they could possibly avert their poverty by being poisoned? We don't think that's the type of choice anybody should be given, a choice between poverty and poison. There's so many ways that people can be provided with ways to make a living without involving hazardousness and toxicity. So we think that's a nonsense equation. But unfortunately, because people don't realize the toxicity, so many of the workers that we've interviewed in China and Southeast Asia, et cetera, they have no clue that when they smash an LCD screen that has mercury tubes in it, that they're harming themselves, that they're very seriously asking for chronic toxicity and cancer. They don't know that. And so this is part of the externality, is we're making people bear the brunt of a cost they're not even aware of. So no, I don't think that's a logical answer, that you have to only give people jobs to survive by poisoning them. It's not the kind of choice that anybody has to make, and it's a false choice.
Before I go to the next one, just a quick check-in with you and the attendees, if it's okay to continue on a little bit longer. We're already at the end of the top of the hour, but we have about 10 more questions left. Is that okay with you, Jim?
Absolutely.
Great. So next, from Peter Feldman. Years ago, it was not an international law that exposed and reversed transboundary hazardous waste shipments, but rather it was environmental activists in partnership with the news media. Has this situation fundamentally changed because of ratification?
We have laws in place now. So before we were exposing a problem, the problem, even though very imperfectly, and it took 25 years to address it properly legally, we're certainly much more advanced where we can actually prosecute people. In fact, BAN has been very much involved in prosecuting people, even in the United States where we don't have the convention, but we use other means. But yeah, in Europe, for example, there's a whole slate of prosecutions that have taken place to prevent this type of trade. And every time you do that, you send a message that this is not okay. So you don't need to prosecute everyone. You just need to prosecute enough people, send enough people to jail that people get the message that this is not okay. So we're far more advanced than the days when we were just showing the scandals and what Greenpeace did with their inventory, pointing out all the problems. But unfortunately, we still have parts of the world like the US, which is a glaring problem where they don't have the Basel Convention. We have bad enforcement in many parts of the world. We have major industries that are trying to weaken these agreements. Whenever their products are being controlled, they don't like it. So the electronics industry thinks they can have an exemption just because it's the electronics industry. Same with shipping. But they really wanted to solve their industrial liabilities. They would make things that are less toxic. So why do ships have to be toxic? Why do computers have to be toxic? This is the way industry should be responding, is to have toxic-free products and therefore no toxic waste. That would be a minimal first step, and we are always pushing industry in that direction.
From Morton Hemkhaus, also related to e-waste, how do you expect e-waste flow to change in the future with many countries increasingly adopting solar and wind as part of their national energy policies?
I don't understand the question. Is solar and wind industry being related to waste generation? I'm not sure of the question, but you broke up a little bit there when you were asking it.
Sorry, he was saying, how do you expect e-waste flows to change in the future with many countries increasingly adopting solar and wind as part of the national policy?
Well, if I'm understanding the question, solar does create its own waste. So right now we're experiencing the first solar panels becoming a big waste issue. Batteries also, all the electronic equipment and electronic cars, wind generation, all has to have battery storage. And if it's not lead acid batteries, it'll be lithium ion batteries, which are also hazardous in some respects and create a tremendous recycling problem. So it is going to create new issues, but it is an improvement. And again, we've got to find electronic storage that is not going to be hazardous in the first instance. And then in the second instance, how can we minimize wastage and resources that are just completely lost? Many times there can be efficient collection systems in developed countries, but then when you move these technologies into the global south, the efficiency of the collection may not be there, or if it is there, they may not be able to handle some of the nuanced recycling that needs to take place. So it does create its own set of issues.
Thank you. From Emmanuel, how does the polluter pay principle fit into the convention? Since most of the polluters are from the developed world.
So the polluter pays principle is exactly what I'm talking about with cost externalization. So the polluter pays. When the polluter pays, then theoretically they're internalizing the costs and not externalizing them. The problem with that slogan, polluter pays, is that it implies in a way that you pollute and then you pay for it. We would rather it be prevented and you pay for the prevention at the outset. So I don't think the polluter pays as a slogan lends itself to thinking more upstream strategies in terms of prevention. And that's why I talk about cost externalities and internalizing those costs through prevention and not through waste mitigation of the hazards and the pollution once already takes place. So, but that's precisely what we're talking about, is making people that are polluting or damaging the earth or others pay the costs upfront to prevent that from ever happening. And all of our pollution is caused by the lack of proper economic accounting and holding people's feet to the fire that you have to pay. When you cause problems, you have to pay. It's part of the economic equation. So even in economics, there's a great amount of ethics involved if you properly are going to have a proper true cost economy, which is what we must strive for.
Thank you. Next from Dr. Pipoyo. Now that the ban is there, how do you think about focusing future efforts on getting in place a financial mechanism to assist developing countries to implement the Basel Convention, similar to Stockholm?
Excellent idea. And Stockholm had a lot of foresight to create a fund to implement, and Basel did not have that foresight. So we have some ad hoc contributions being made on different issues. For example, when BAN first raised the electronic waste issue in Africa with our report, The Digital Dump, back in 2005, the EU pitched in €1 million to work on the e-waste problem in Africa. And that was very effective. A lot of good research was done and good awareness raising. There's still a tremendous problem, however. So we need to think of those funding mechanisms. There was another offer at one of the recent meetings to fund the Bamako Convention from European countries as well. So these are things that are done too often in an ad hoc way and not part of what these conventions like the Basel Convention should really be thinking about. Because without these resources, it's really hard to combat the problems in these parts of the world.
From Marina Bukoba, what is the best strategy to oppose the EU to exempt IT industries from the Basel ban?
Whoa, I would love to know. I'm shocked that the EU is doing this because, again, EU was champions of the Basel ban. And I'm still shocked to this day when I hear the EU delegates in the Basel meeting say we want to exempt electronics with the weakest amount of controls just because they can be repaired. And the problem with this is that anything can theoretically be called repairable. And once you do that and you take it outside of the convention and outside of the controls of the convention, you lose all transparency, you lose all controls. Countries don't know that the waste is coming to them. They have no means to say no to it, don't even know it's coming. So without it being under the scope of the convention, we lose everything. And yet the electronics industry has pushed the EU to take that position. And the EU is very powerful. They're a 28 country voting bloc. And without any other big blocs of that kind pushing back in the other direction, they tend to win the day. Usually the EU is on the side of the environment, and then we get a benefit from that power. But when they're on the wrong side, the EU can be really insidious. And in this case, that's what's going on. We're trying to shame them, but also the industries like Apple, Dell, HP, all the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers of electronics, are culpable in trying to escape the control procedures of the Basel Convention. And they're starting this process through a guideline, but it's a slippery slope. Even though a guideline is not legally binding, that's where they start. And then they try to change the actual annexes of the convention. And this is what we're fighting right now. So I'm not sure the best strategy, but I think shaming the EU would be helpful, but also making the public aware of what the electronics industry is doing.
From Michael Funke, do you see any legal options to export IT equipment like computers and TVs from Europe to a developing country like Ghana for testing and refurbishment, if this is done in a bonded warehouse under the condition the negative fractions that might occur are transported back to Europe?
I think we had this question already, almost precisely the same one. So I won't answer it, but I will just answer it very quickly to say, no, I don't see that as an option. Again, it happens in a developing country in a context where they do not have the safety nets to protect themselves. And it sounds very good theoretically to use cheap labor for this dirty job, but in fact, it's really harmful.
From Tricia Aurora, do you see or do you have any evidence of waste flows in India?
Waste flowing into India has diminished. It used to be a really big problem, including with electronic waste. But again, they are starting to control their border, not quite as effectively as China. But we have not seen with our trackers much electronic waste flowing into India. We see it going into Pakistan, however, right next door. But within India, if that's what you're talking about, there is a lot of movement of waste, and it goes to the informal sectors and really dirty operations. So within India, you have tremendous problems with electronic waste mismanagement. In the informal sectors, they're just doing what they can to get the best value. So they're dumping all the residues and just trying to extract copper and gold. And the rest of it becomes just devastating pollution, not only for the communities, but for the workers' health. It's really quite devastating.
Okay, from Vijay Satyawan, there's two questions. First, does the entry into force of the Basel ban mean that the Basel Convention has evolved from a regulatory system to restriction? And the second question is, will the Basel ban affect the e-waste trade in its efforts to stop it to developing countries, for example, Southeast Asian countries, with the ongoing developments of e-waste technical guidelines?
The first part of the question, Absolutely, Basel has evolved in a good way as of December 5th. It took them a really long time, but now we have the original promise of the convention in the convention as it was meant to be 25 years ago. And if the US and a few other countries had not blocked it, that would have been the convention a long time ago. So it's definitely evolved, but there's still a lot of issues and there's still a lot of problems. We have to be very vigilant. BAN tries to do a lot of tracking of the waste, so we have an early warning system of where things shift to. Very often when one country puts up an obstacle or starts to enforce their borders, it just goes to another location. We saw that waste was not going to, was going all to mainland China. Mainland China restricted it with really strong customs actions. And then it all moved to Hong Kong, where Hong Kong was operating in a different legislative arena, and they were allowing it. So we had to expose what was going on in Hong Kong. Now Hong Kong government has blocked it there, and now we're seeing waste moving to Pakistan and Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries. So these guys, they're always looking for an outlet to externalize costs. Until we close those doors completely and really do proper enforcement at the exporting side, like in the United States and in Europe, and moreover do what China's done, be very strict, then it's going to continue because there's money to be made with cost externalization. It's the name of the game for production waste management, is try to find a way to get rid of this problem without paying for it. And the developing countries are ripe for this exploitation. So we have to be very vigilant, and it means enforcement a la China, and it means setting standards like China has done, where they have very strict standards of levels of contamination in plastic and paper waste. We're encouraging all Asian countries to adopt a China standard so that there's a level playing field, so that they're not the recipients of waste just moving from what used to go to China to their doors, to their shores. That's what's happening now. So it makes total sense for people to do what China did. I'm not saying China's brilliant on everything they do, they're certainly not, but in this instance, I think they did the calculus of what was actually good for China, and they realized that even economically, this trade was really a problem, really a liability.
Okay. Another one from Tricia saying, as we understand it, the US exports waste to India, and it's illegal as both countries have not ratified. Please clarify.
India has ratified the convention, but not the Ban Amendment. We're hoping India will ratify the Ban Amendment. The waste moving from US to India, I'd like to know about it. We caught them doing some plastic waste exports that originally went to Indonesia, and then they got, instead of going back to the US when Indonesia rejected those shipments, they were pushed into India. We exposed that. So any information you have about movements to India from the US, we're very interested in working on those and trying to find out who's responsible. There are ways we can prosecute things in the US even without the Ban Amendment, even without the Basel Convention. For example, the US has very well-developed fraud laws. And so when we couldn't prosecute people for exporting waste for environmental reasons under the US laws, we got them for fraud because they lied to their customers saying they would never export. And we've been able to prosecute 3 companies, sending their executives to jail. So there are means, even in the US, to prosecute this. And once you do that, it sends a very strong message. But I'm not really aware of a strong flow from the US to India at this moment in time.
Great, and a last question from Josh. He said he's trying to understand your answer to the question about repair possibilities and the idea that you can't send used computers there because it might leak out and become hazardous waste. But according to the variant of economics you just laid out, it would seem that no one in a developing country should be permitted to buy a new computer, either because developing countries do not have state-of-the-art e-waste facilities. Can you explain this?
Well, it's one way to extrapolate my arguments, but I'm basically saying that yes, there's a real problem with managing electronic waste in developing countries. You do not want to exacerbate that by bringing in yet more of it and exploiting the workers there just because they're a low-wage country and you can get the labor cheaper. There are tremendous issues, however, but they don't get improved by bringing more of the problem into the country. They get improved by the kind of investment that was asked about previously, that countries need to have this type of resources and investment to create their own infrastructure, to manage their own waste, to create their own products that are less hazardous, etc. So this is the answer, not to use developing countries as dumping grounds and to just try to exploit the fact that they have a low wage situation. Because what comes with low wages is very poor infrastructure. We need to bring better infrastructure to these countries. Clearly, there's a huge inequity on the planet right now of wealth, which is the fundament of this problem, which we haven't even talked about. But the fact that we have such inequity, and it's getting worse between the rich and the poor, will continue to generate more opportunities, it's the wrong word to use, but more possibilities of exploitation. And that's not what the circular economy is about. The circular economy is supposed to minimize externalities, minimize leakage, bring everybody's infrastructure up. And unfortunately, lately, too many people think of a circular economy as a geographic circle, that they're going to send waste around the world, all in the name of recycling. And this is what precisely has been the problem for the last 20 some years. Recycling has a good name. Refurbishment has a good name. It is actually a good idea for the most part, but it can be done like anything else in a very dirty and exploitive way. And we can't tolerate that anymore. So I'm happy that the ban amendment is going to help people think, well, instead of finding another hiding place for this or a cheaper way to deal with it, let's deal with these problems upstream. Why are we making computers that are hazardous to begin with? That's a much more efficient way to deal with that problem. And so this is what the incentive will be going forward. More and more companies will realize we can't move this stuff around the world if it is hazardous. We're going to need to deal with that issue by making our products non-hazardous. And I've had discussions with the electronics industry. They have the ability to make non-toxic computers today. They can do it. They could have done it 5 years ago, but they're not doing it because they don't have enough economic incentive to do so. And the reason they don't is because there are these cheap ways of externalizing the costs rather than dealing with them internally.
Well, this concludes our webinar. Thank you very much, Jim. The last message comes from Peter Feldman, and actually many different attendees have echoed these, saying thank you, Jim and Ban, for this very informative presentation and for the hard work for the past 25 years. Congratulations on the accomplishments, and we look forward to the next steps and a cleaner future.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to doing this again very soon. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I put in a message and put in Jim's email as well as mine. We will be posting this recording and sharing the presentation. You can always email Jim in the future if you have any further questions, or if you have any questions to me regarding getting a copy of the presentation, please feel free to do so. And we wish everyone a wonderful night, morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on wherever you are.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.